Hello, and welcome to our live chat with the Project FeederWatch team here on the Cornell Lab Bird Camps. I'm Charles Eldermeyer, project leader for the cams, and today we're going to be learning about the science behind your feeder birds and answering your questions with help from two people on Project FeederWatch, Dr. Emma Greig and Holly Faulkner. Hey, how are you guys doing today?
Great.
Awesome. I hope everybody out in the audience is also doing great. We've got a jam-packed, probable hour of question asking and answering, but we thought it'd be good to start out by introducing Emma and Holly. And so Emma is the project leader for FeederWatch, and how long have you been doing that?
I've been doing it for 6 years.
And what's that been like?
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love the program so much. It feels really good to work on a program that I think is such a good effort. So I love it.
Awesome. And what were you studying before you sort of got your fingers into FeederWatch?
I was studying the songs of fairy wrens, which are a little Australian bird. So very different than managing a citizen science program, but it was really wonderful to travel around Australia and find those birds.
And those are some spectacular looking birds, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suggest anyone listening Google fairy wren when they are done with the feeder cam.
After the question and answer session. And then Holly is the project assistant for two of our long-standing citizen science projects here at the lab, both Project FeederWatch and NestWatch. And what's that like, working with like two of these great projects that are known across the world?
It is busy, but it's a lot of fun. Answering phone calls and managing the email inboxes, social media, talking to all sorts of people that are interested in birds. It's really great. Awesome.
And what kind of things were you doing before you started working at the lab?
So I did field work a lot before I came to the lab. One of the seasons I was out in Minnesota doing night surveys with American woodcock and morning surveys for golden-winged warblers. So that was a lot of fun traipsing all over northern Minnesota, in the bogs and the swamps and all over.
Awesome. And you're also quite an artist as well, both birds and other things, is that right?
Yep. So I also did a lot of art on the side. I still do that and make a little bit of a hobby income on that too. So a lot of things.
That's great. So one of the things we always hear from people in our audience is they always like to tell us about the things they like about birds, or particularly birds they like. So I thought a nice way to kick things off would be to ask you just a very simple question, not even from our audience, just from me. What's your favorite bird and why? So you want to take a first crack at that, Emma?
Good question. Yeah, I think I know without any hesitation. It's a bird called the Greig finch. They're like a little rainbow. There's another one to Google if you don't know what it is. You just can't believe that it's a real bird, but they are an Australian small finch and just totally gorgeous.
Awesome. And how about you?
I like a lot of birds, so it's hard to pick, but I think I'd go with common loons. I really like to hike and camp and kayak in the Adirondacks, and that's one of my favorite sounds when I'm camping at night. So.
Yeah, especially at night. The fact that they're out there making those vocalizations at night is so cool to wake up to. You know, even if it's the thing that wakes you up, ultimately. It's a nice feeling. Well, now that we've gotten a chance to know about you both, I don't know that all the people in our audience know necessarily all that much about Project FeederWatch. So I thought maybe it'd be great to get an overview of what it is and what it hopes to do with the help of people just like the people that are watching our cam all across North America. So could you provide us with a little bit of an overview or history of the project?
Yeah, definitely. So it's been going on for, this is now the 33rd year of the joint effort between the Lab of Ornithology and Bird Studies Canada running FeederWatch. So about 20,000 people in the US and 3,000 in Canada every year sign up and they count the birds at their feeders and then submit their counts online. So it's this wonderful effort of people across the country to take their hobby of bird feeding and turn it into a really meaningful data set that lets us look at changes in bird populations.
That's an incredible number of people sending in information, and what's the geographical extent of people that are sending in? Like where just Canada and the U.S. or?
Yeah, it just is within Canada and the U.S., but within those two countries, there's a really great geographic spread of folks. People from all over are seeing all kinds of birds, and because with the FeederWatch protocol, everybody is always counting birds in the same way, we can compare counts from, say, the 1990s in Florida with counts from 2019 in Alaska. So it makes it a really, really great data set because of everyone counting in the same way.
That's great. So what does it mean to count in the same way? How does it even work, and can anybody participate, or do you have to have some special certification? Or
Yeah, so anybody can participate in FeederWatch. We can provide a lot of help with identification, and we have a lot of ways to help folks, get into knowing what kind of birds are coming to their feeders. And then as a participant, you're counting the highest number of each species of bird that comes to your feeders simultaneously. I know that's a mouthful, but basically it helps us prevent that you're not counting the same bird twice, and it gives us a general idea of the numbers of birds that are in your area. We can learn, where there are birds and where birds aren't, because you're also reporting even if you only see just a couple of birds that come during your 2-day count.
So if you have, for example, 2 birds come to a feeder, fly away, and another bird come to a feeder, same species, that would be how many birds? That would
be 2 birds, because that was 2 birds is the highest number you saw at one time.
Gotcha. So, yeah, that makes it very seems like a very straightforward way to make sure you're not overcounting the birds.
Absolutely.
Right? And is there any other kind of data that are taken in addition to sort of the species and number of birds? What sorts of things?
Yeah, so we also we ask folks to report how long they've watched those birds, so we kind of have an idea of how many birds you've seen within a certain time span. And you also report your average snow depth over the course of your 2-day count. And then we use some really good databases full of precipitation data. We used to collect that data, but now we're using these databases, so it's one less thing that our participants have to collect.
That's great. And so you have all these people, thousands of people collecting data across North America, basically, at least northern North America, the US and Canada. After doing this for 30 plus years, what are the kinds of things that these citizen scientists have helped us learn from the world and will continue helping us learn moving forward?
Yeah, well, so much. There's so much that you can do with bird counts. Not only can we see species that decline, we can also see range expansions and species that are increasing in response to changes in the environment, changes in climate. We can watch invasive species spread across the continent. For example, the Eurasian collared dove. Yeah. FeederWatch data picked up the initial start of those doves in Florida. And if you go and look at the FeederWatch maps, you can see this yellow, whatever you want to call it, thing spread across the continent as those doves spread from Florida to the west and northwest. And another thing that people in FeederWatch collect and that we've learned so much about is House Finch eye disease. So that's another really cool aspect of the program that goes a little bit beyond just counting and starts to tell us a few details about those birds and whether or not they're sick. And so this lets us learn about disease dynamics.
Well, that's great because we did get a couple questions we'll hit a little bit later that deal with questions about disease. Mm-hmm. And, I'm guessing that the people that asked those questions didn't even know that FeederWatch actively gathers data about those birds.
Yeah.
And is it just house finches or?
We now allow people to record also house finch eye disease in goldfinches and help me remember what other species.
Purple finches.
Purple finches.
Evening grosbeaks maybe as well.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah,
I can't remember exactly.
A couple of different finches, but when you report your count, a little pop-up will show up and it'll just ask whether you've looked for it, and then if you did, tell us how many you saw with the disease.
And you mentioned that you guys can help. The Project FeederWatch also has resources for people, so people might not know all the birds necessarily in their area or may not feel that comfortable, right?
Yeah.
So what kinds of ways does FeederWatch essentially work with these participants to support them learning more about the birds in their backyard?
Yeah, so first of all, every new participant gets a Common Feeder Birds of North America poster showing some of the most common feeder birds in the east, and on the back it shows all the western species that come to feeders in the winter, and it shows their winter plumage. So it's you're not going to be looking for breeding plumage birds, you're going to be seeing them in their winter plumage. So that's something everybody gets, and then we have a ton of resources on feederwatch.org. It's on our Learn tab. You'll see we have Tricky Bird ID to identify between those tough species like house, purple, and Cassin's finches, Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks, those kinds of species. We've got a whole section called it's common feeder birds, so that can really help you, whittle down what kind of birds like each kind of food. And so if you see a bird that's eating your thistle, you can kind of whittle it down to some species, whereas other species wouldn't be eating that kind of food.
So. Oh, right. Yeah, so they have their own sort of order that they put in at the takeout window.
Right.
And then you can use that to help identify the birds. That's pretty cool. And we actually we've had a Cooper's hawk over the last couple of years, a juvie each year that's spent a lot of time perched on our feeder setup out there. So, and I think there is a question or two lower down. So you mentioned the website, and I just thought I'd just let you say it again, where people can learn more about this and join. And maybe you could say a couple words about what it means to join Project FeederWatch.
Yeah. Do you want to take it?
Sure, yeah. So the easiest way to join FeederWatch is to go to the feederwatch.org website, and then there's a big red button that says join, renew, or donate. And so that's the way to get in and sign up for the program. There's a small participation fee, and that participation fee supports the program. So without this contribution, this small financial contribution that everybody makes, the program wouldn't exist. So I think it's really amazing that feeder watchers not only give their time to keep this program going, but also provide the financial support to keep it going.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I think that is so amazing, and that is why it is a 33-year-long data set. It's because of all of that support.
That's awesome. And then when you talk about them participating, what's sort of the time span? Winter varies. You could ask the people in Florida what they think of their winter, and ask the people in New York what they think of their winter. As anybody watching the cam right now can tell, it's kind of a raw day out there.
Yeah.
So what's the sort of general duration? When does it start? When does it end?
So it normally starts the second Saturday in November and goes 21 weeks. So that's usually the first week in April. And participants are counting. It's a count made over 2 days, and those 2-day counts should be at least 5 days apart. So generally, you're counting the same 2 days every week for about 21 weeks at most.
So it's something you could do on the weekend if you wanted to,
Absolutely.
or in the morning when you're making your breakfast, even, or sitting eating your breakfast, you could do your count.
And the time commitment is really low too. I mean, you can do it for 5 minutes, you can do it all day, you can do one count all season, you can do all 21. It's totally up to the participant. All of those counts are valuable to us.
And with that diversity of options for how to gather data, you're still able to learn from what they're sending in.
That's right, because everybody, when they do their count, they record how much effort they make. And so then any bird observation that we have in our big data set, we can correct for the amount of time people were watching. So because they tell us, the participants tell us the amount of effort they spend watching, we can then take that into account in all of our analyses.
Right, so basically if you watch for an hour or if you watch for 10 hours, you expect that person in 10 hours to probably have more things to report
Exactly.
than that person in 1 hour, so you'd want to be able to correct for those things. That's great.
It is, and I do just want to emphasize what Holly pointed out, which is that because we can correct for whatever amount of time people want to watch, people can watch for whatever time they feel. So it's very flexible and can accommodate really any schedule. So yeah, even if folks only want to count a couple times throughout the winter, that's still really valuable data.
And related too, even if you don't see any birds, maybe you only have time to watch for 5 minutes on each day of your count, and you don't see any birds during those 5 minutes. That's still important for us to know, because we need to know where birds are not occurring as well as where they are.
That's great. And you mentioned you wind up talking with a lot of participants when they're looking for support or when they just want to talk to you about cool things they're seeing or share some neat observation. What kinds of participants do you find that you have? Are people doing this alone? Are they doing it with other people? Is there any way you would go about describing who a feeder watcher even is?
I mean, we get people from all over. We have classrooms that participate with their teacher as the head. We've got, retired folks. We've got families. We've got all sorts of people at different skill levels too. People that are so sure of the species they see, and other people that, aren't sure what some of the more common species are. And we're more than happy to help all of them in whatever questions they have.
That's great. I mean, it's the sort of thing, speaking from my experience, I know my mom loved doing FeederWatch for a number of years, and so it's something that I remember even from being a kid. being a part of my life growing up, which is pretty cool.
Absolutely.
And now I'm sitting across the table from the people making it happen. It's great.
You must be starstruck right now.
I am a little starstruck. You can probably tell my eyes. Well, this might be a great time to sort of start shifting into the questions from our audience. We're about 15 minutes into our hour here, and we actually got some Project FeederWatch questions from our audience. So these are people that either are already doing it and have questions, or are considering doing it. And one I feel like you've already touched on, Holly, so I'm going to start with that. This person wrote, "I don't get many birds in my feeders, or I only get house sparrows. How is that helpful to FeederWatch?" And you mentioned, but it's worth bringing up again, I think, because lots of people look out their windows and they're not sure they'll see a bird.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, even if you don't see any birds, they're valuable to us. I mean, this is how we track those bird losses. And, space in certain regions, if you're seeing less birds, it's important to report that so that we know and we can help track that movement.
That's cool. And so thinking along those lines, one person wrote, "This is my first year participating." This is from Humble Monkey 27 on Instagram. "This is my first year participating. I read the whole pamphlet. I have many birds coming and going. I'm not sure if I recounted a bird twice. I don't want to send in inaccurate data." So you brought up some things, but she asked, or he, "Do you have any tips I can use?" So you mentioned one, which is you only count the simultaneous number of birds, the maximum number, right? And that's the only number you report at the end of your count. But are there any other tips that you guys share with feeder watchers for counting birds? Things maybe when you have a lot of birds or when you don't?
Yeah, there are some options. So let's say you see a bunch of blackbird species and they land at your feeders. They might pick around for a bit, but they fly off before you can count them all. Yeah. So in those regards, or in those instances, you want to try to make a good estimate for how many birds you're seeing. But we also have an interesting tool on our bird list. So every person is going to see a bird list that's tailored to their location. But if you see a bird like a blackbird and you're not sure what species it is, or a finch, and you didn't get a chance to identify it before it flew away, we have this add species button, and if you click on that, you can type in stuff like blackbird or finch species, and a general category will pop up. And if you add that to your count, that helps us know what you saw, but maybe you weren't able to identify it. And like I said, if you're giving us a good estimate of what you saw, that's better than not reporting it.
Right. And so there's that accuracy issue, I think, which estimating is, making a good estimate, but also accuracy. I saw blackbirds, but I'm not going to tell you I saw something that I didn't or that I couldn't tell, right?
It's better to say that you're uncertain and be uncertain than to say you're certain and have it be incorrect.
Right.
So, and it's okay to be uncertain.
Right.
Another tip that I actually have learned from feeder watchers that have really high quantities of birds at their feeders is sometimes they'll take a quick photo of their bird feeding area and then use that photo to do a quick count and say, oh, well, wow, it's about 125 mourning doves out there. And that can make it a little bit easier than actually trying to count them when they're moving all over the place.
Right.
And that's a lot of mourning doves.
That's a lot.
I've never been around 120, but
than
I would like to see that, actually. That would be really cool. It would be a little bit unnerving, I think, because they move around so much when they're on the ground. It's kind of weird.
Right.
I don't know if anyone's ever had that many mourning doves. Starlings made it up. Starlings. That's a good
there
one.
You go.
Yeah.
Starlings, that would be it.
Definitely.
Right. Well, sort of relating to that, someone wrote in, Bridget from over email wrote in, "I have a bird photo booth motion activated camera by my feeders. I leave it out all day and I get images of almost every bird. Can I use the images captured by my photo booth to do a feeder count?" Is that something that's, because technology is everywhere, right? I mean, obviously we have a camera out in our feeder garden that we're watching right now as we're talking. So what can people use technology to augment or use in place of sitting and watching out their window?
It's kind of a multifaceted question because it all depends on what your camera has in view. So if your camera is attached right to the bowl of mealworms or sunflower seeds, whatever you have, and it's blocking your view of other birds that could be attracted to that specific bowl, you're not going to be able to count or accurately report your count of birds that were attracted to that count site. So it's kind of, dependent on what kind of view you have. If you have a camera maybe that's viewing your whole count site, sure, that's a great way to keep an idea of it. Maybe you have it go all day long and you come home and you watch it for, that might be a little tough. But,
Fast forward, yeah.
Something like that, I think is a little bit easier to work with than when you've got your view blocked for half your count site.
Well, and the important thing to really think about here is that we don't want to have some people counting in a different way than others, because then the counts of birds aren't really comparable. So maybe that person seems to have more or less of a particular species, but it's not because there are really more or less of that species. It's just because they were counting in a different way.
Right.
So if you're going to use a camera to do your FeederWatch count, you still need to follow the protocol of the most number in view simultaneously. But you wouldn't want to add up all 27 photos of one blue jay. That would be like counting every time a blue jay comes to visit, which then you might be counting the same blue jay over and over again. Right. So that's why using a camera to do your count is usually not going to work super well, because it's not a good, it's usually a small view and it's counting the same bird over and over again.
Right, and that's a great point. All those cool pictures that I see from bird photo booths or other bird photography things that you just hook up to a feeder, usually it's looking at one slot on one feeder or one little dish that only one bird could ever land at, right? So your maximum count would almost only ever be one, right? You'd have some maybe idea of diversity, but you wouldn't get that abundance information.
Right. Exactly,
And so keeping on this topic of feeders, Nan writes in over email, I have 3 feeders located around my house that attract different birds. Can I total them together for a single site entry?
All right. Well, ideally, count sites should be an area that you can view from one vantage point and count consistently from week to week. We do allow folks that have feeders around their houses to count birds at those feeders, but again, this is tying back into that, making sure everybody counts the same way. You shouldn't be adding birds that are seen at your back feeder and your front feeder. Let's say you see a chickadee in your backyard and a chickadee in your front yard. That's still one chickadee because that's the most amount you saw at your feeders at one time.
Right, so in order to count birds across multiple feeders, you'd have to be able to see all those feeders at the same time and look across them to see what your maximum number at any one point simultaneously viewed is.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think another important point to make about that is if you did decide that, okay, you're going to look at different parts of your house and keep just one tally of the most you see at one time across those feeders, even though you can't see them all at the same time, that's okay. But then the important thing to make sure you do is that every time you do your count, you do it in the same way.
Right, you spend the same amount of time.
Well, you don't have to spend the same amount of time, but you have to take into account the same amount of space, so that we know that looking at your counts through time, you don't have fewer birds one week because you only looked at feeder number 1, and then next week you looked at 3 feeders and had more birds. Well, again, then it confounds the way in which you count with what's happening with the birds. So being consistent in the way that you as an individual count is really important and provides really much more informative counts about or illustrates change through time better than changing your own method to suit whatever you feel for that weekend.
Well, it's a neat idea because counting seems so simple, right? And the things you guys have learned are actually quite complex from the simple counting. And as long as everyone's following kind of the general guidelines for how to do it consistently, it really allows these complex patterns to come out, which is really neat, I think. And then we got an email from someone that said, my housing association does not allow feeders, but I have bird baths and some plants that attract birds. Can I participate?
Oh, absolutely. So your count site should be including things that attract birds. So bird baths, plantings, bird feeders. If you don't have one or more of those things, that's okay. But yeah, as long as your count site has something that attracts birds, you're more than welcome to participate in FeederWatch.
I would even encourage people who
Absolutely.
don't have feeders but have water and plantings to count, because then those are sites where we can learn about what birds come to a backyard without feeders. And we don't really have many participants of that with that style of setup in
Gotcha.
FeederWatch. So I encourage it.
Yeah, it'd be really neat to see more of that, right?
It really
sort of
would.
widen what we would know or be able to talk about.
That's
and
right.
part of that participation does include you describing your count site, so that is how we know what kind of feeders you have, how many you have, and what the habitat looks like around your feeders as well.
Yeah, and so doing that count site description, it seems sometimes maybe like an extraneous activity that's not as important as the birds. No. It's so important to have a sense for how many feeders a person puts out, what types, because that's very much related to the quantity of birds that they see, and really helps us understand why in one place someone might have a ton of birds and in another place they might not. So those count site descriptions are really valuable.
I mean, you can imagine having a hummingbird feeder, for example, at one site and not at another. And you might just suspect that the one with the hummingbird feeder is going to get more hummingbirds on their count. But if you don't know that they have a hummingbird feeder and the other site doesn't, you don't know necessarily. You can't connect the dots as well.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, as you might imagine, the people watching our cameras, and I think just bird lovers everywhere, are continuously asking questions about what is going on with birds. But when you start actually actively doing stuff for birds too, it like opens up a whole new batch of questions. So we had that deal specifically with Project FeederWatch. Then there's some very general questions that come back to the idea of feeding birds. And I really like this one starting out. Anastasia wrote in on the website, "Why do birds eat so much?" And I think it's just a funny place to start because you can put these feeders out into an environment that presumably has food in it already, because the birds are living there whether or not maybe they're living there whether or not you put out a feeder. But why do birds eat so much, or do birds eat so much? It seems like a really general question, but I'm guessing you have a little insight into birds' metabolism.
Yeah, they do eat a lot. And so that old saying, oh, so-and-so eats like a bird, which suggests that they don't eat much, is really, it's the opposite is true. Birds eat quite a bit. And it's because they do have a fast metabolism. A lot of them are really small. And the extreme example are hummingbirds, which are super, super tiny, go through so much energy to beat their wings and maintain their body temperature even though they're so small.
Go through molts.
They go through molts, and they just consume huge numbers of calories for their body size. So that's why
That's maybe why they eat so much.
Yeah, you
Especially when they're preparing for migration too. That's a great time for them to be fueling up so they can make those calories last while they're up in the air.
Well, it's interesting because we got a question from Justine LJ on Instagram asking, is it true that winter is the most important time to keep that feeder stocked up? I currently have black-capped chickadees coming every day, and I wouldn't want to throw off their winter routine if I go away. And someone else also wrote on Instagram, sometimes I leave town for a few weeks, and I'm gonna, I've done this in the past, I'm gonna do it again this winter. What's gonna happen to my birds if I'm unable to fill these feeders? So, do you have any insight about what happens when you're not feeding the birds, or is there a time of year that's feeding birds is maybe most important?
I mean, feeding birds can pretty much happen any time of year, keeping in mind that all seasons there is a lot of natural food usually as well. There might be less in winter, but it depends on your latitude too, and depending on how much snow you get and the kinds of plants that grow in your area as well. A lot of birds, even if you take your feeders in for a while, they're going to have a lot of other sources, other feeders in your neighborhood, out in the woods, fields, seeds, and all sorts of not so much in winter insects, but maybe in Florida and the southern parts of the United States.
Well, it's funny that you bring up insects because Jace wrote into our website and asked, how do the birds eat if their prey, insects, are hibernating or are dormant somewhere? Anything you can share about birds' diets in winter, maybe versus summer, or does it change? Are there insects to be eaten in the winter that we don't know about?
There might be some insects for birds to eat in the winter, but birds' diets do shift seasonally. And so in the winter, one thing that a lot of birds will do or not a lot, some birds will do is they'll feed on seeds that they've cached. So they'll take a little acorn or a little sunflower seed, hide it somewhere, and then come back to it later when it's really cold out and seeds are less available. In the spring and summer, birds are often nesting, and so they're trying to keep alive not only themselves, but also little baby birds that need to grow and create more tissue. And so at those times of year, they're often focused more on collecting insects and really high protein meals because that's better for nestlings. So there are these seasonal changes in what birds will eat based on what they need and based on what's around.
Is that part of the reason why I crave like fat in the winter, why I want to like slather everything in butter? Is that, yeah, it's kind of the same thing, I feel.
I think that's what it is, yeah.
Well, in Opus Great on Twitter, you brought up caching, and this person wrote in that their blue jays currently are caching their peanuts in the ground and covering it with a leaf. I understand the instinct of this, but what happens once the snow hits? They can't get them out of the snow, right? And someone else wrote into the website asking, can birds get through snow? Covering feeders in this case, but it sort of gets to the same question. Even if you have birds caching food, like these blue jays, which I've watched hop around the yard and tuck it like right at the base of a tree, maybe underneath a leaf. What's going on there? Because it seems like they're just throwing food away once. I mean, they can't remember it, right?
They have a really good memories. Some chickadees, their brains actually get bigger in the autumn so that when they're caching, they have more place in their brain to store the memories of where they keep all their seeds.
Wow.
Yeah. So birds really do have a good spatial memory, ones that cache. And so even if there's a little snow covering the spots, they can remember based on the location of trees and stones and things around, landmarks that they use to keep track of where they put things.
Sort of, they don't need a map necessarily with an X marks the spot, but they're keeping track of the objects in their environment. Is that what you're, yeah.
And they tend to cache in a lot of different areas too. So like you were saying, at the base of trees, in the forest, in the ground, wherever. So even when there are, maybe there's a couple feet of snow on the ground, they're probably going to have another place that they've been storing that they can take advantage of in those situations.
Yeah, and whether or not birds can get through snow depends on what kind of bird it is, how big, how deep and crusty the snow is. Right. So sometimes, sure, maybe you've seen little birds scratching like little juncos. They'll jump backwards and scratch the snow. They're trying to get down to the dirt and get to seeds and such. Doves will flick their bills back and forth to push the snow away and get to dirt. So birds have ways of doing it. But there is something that a lot of feeder watchers and people who aren't feeder watchers but feed birds might notice, and that's when there are really big snowstorms. Often those are the times when you'll see lots of birds at your feeders, because when snow is really deep, well, there's only so far down a junco can dig with his little feet. So they do really appreciate bird feeders when it's really cold and really snowy. And so I think that's part of why people like to feed birds more in winter, because winter in northern latitudes is the time when conditions are sometimes really tough for birds, and that bird food that we put out maybe helps them get through those tough times a little more than usual.
Yeah, helps them spend a little less energy finding that food.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of food, that's actually probably the second most asked set of questions, because everybody just wonders about the food. Oh, but there is one more touch on weather. Since we're talking about weather, before we sort of move away, there's a few different questions that came in about weather, including, do we need to bring in feeder trays to prevent wet seeds? So a lot of questions about wet seeds, mold, so first of all, think about weather and your feeders. Is there anything that people should be doing if you're feeding birds and it's raining or snowing on their feeder setups?
Not necessarily, but it is really good to keep an eye on your seed and make sure it's not getting moldy, cleaning your feeders, making sure that, even if it does get wet, you want to keep an eye on it just so that there's no mold growth. But in general, a lot of birds' food already gets wet in nature. They're going to be the flowers and the plants that they find in nature with those seeds in them already experience rainfall as well. So it's kind of, take it with a grain of salt, right? Make sure that it's not going to get too spoiled, but
Yeah. And a lot of tray feeders have drainage holes, so you want feeders where any water that does get in can drain. A lot of feeders will have a little cover over the top so that the seeds aren't getting completely drenched. So think about that when you're choosing your feeders. So even if seeds get a bit wet, as long as they can dry out, they'll probably be all right. It's when they stay moist and damp that mold tends to grow, as we know, right?
Right, well, and I was going to save this till later, but it seems like a great time to jump in. You mentioned cleaning feeders, and right now we're talking about, the food, number one, might be an issue that could make birds sick, but why else should people be cleaning their feeders? Are there other reasons beyond just the food?
Dirty feeders are often a really it's a vector for disease, and so keeping your feeders clean, weekly to bi-weekly is a really good way to help prevent the spread of that disease. Some of the recent research that came out last year showed that cleaning with soap and water, making sure all of that debris is gone from your feeder, and then soaking it in a bleach solution is one of the best ways to help reduce those bacteria loads, such as salmonella. I think that was the study was on salmonella, and the feeders that were only washed out with soap and water were more likely to have salmonella on them than those that were in bleach.
And you mentioned sort of the ideal frequency with which you might, what was that again? Just so people...
Yeah, ideally, it's about once every 1 or 2 weeks. It all depends on probably the traffic to your feeders, too.
Yeah.
If you're getting a lot of birds, it's probably better to clean it more often if you're only getting a couple. And if you see disease, a diseased finch with House Finch eye disease or something like that, one bird, definitely take them down, clean them. If you're starting to see a lot of sick birds, it might be good to take them down for a week or so to help those sick birds disperse, and then you can put them back up and, slowly attract back the more healthy individuals.
And if you see no sick birds, maybe it's not as urgent to clean them as frequently. So you can use your common sense about it a little bit.
Yeah,
right?
I find, at least for me, what I do is I rarely let my feeders go all the way down, but if I haven't been paying that close, or I've had a really busy week, let's say, and the feeder gets down to just about nothing, I use that as an opportunity to clean the feeder. Because it doesn't happen that often, but it might happen a couple times a month, so it's just one way that I personally try and keep my feeders clean.
Yeah, if you're starting to notice them getting soiled with bird feces, that kind of thing, it probably is a good time to bring them down, clean them, and put them back up.
And since we're still talking a little bit about House Finch eye disease, do the birds that get that ever recover from it? And do you have some sense of like the scale of birds that recover versus succumb to the disease?
Yeah, a lot of them actually do recover from aviary experiments where they've infected birds with House Finch eye disease. Something like 80% of birds recover.
Wow.
So a lot of the house finches that we see that are completely healthy now may have been exposed to the disease and carry antibodies in their system. And actually a lot of even non-house finches carry antibodies for that house finch eye disease bacteria, which is called Mycoplasma gallisepticum. So lots of birds can get over it and survive.
Well, that's great, because it's not that fun to see a poor little sick bird.
Right.
No,
it's nice to think of them bouncing back.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. So since we're sort of nuts and bolting on feeders and things, I thought we'll just keep in this vein and then come back to the food in just a little bit. Here's one that I don't know how often you get, but Genevieve over email said, I thought it was safe to put up my bird feeders for FeederWatch, but they were decimated by a bear this weekend in the Catskills. When would it be safe to hang them? And do you have any advice for people like that? Because you probably don't have your finger on the pulse of bear hibernation, right?
Well, we actually have a section on our website that addresses this. Basically, the time when bears hibernate is probably different across most of the continent here. So we recommend not feeding when the birds are still out and about, the bears are still out and about. But if you're not sure when the bears are hibernating in your area, it's probably good to talk to your local state wildlife authorities. They're going to have the most up-to-date information about the animals in your area, and they'll be able to help you pinpoint that period where the bears are going to be inactive.
And so is it still okay if somebody has to wait until December, say? Could they still join FeederWatch then? And,
Definitely.
Okay, after the bears go away?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Remember what we were saying before, how even if you only counted a couple times all winter, Well, your first count could be December. Your first count could be January.
Yep.
Whoops, it's still valuable data.
And I'm guessing this is a no, but Susan wrote into our website, is there a commercial wild bird food that we could obtain that would not entice the bears to join them at the feeder?
Don't know.
Yeah, I've seen bears eat a lot of things. This is the
Bears
problem.
are omnivores, and they're pretty opportunistic when they can find it. I mean, think about all those bear canisters when you're out hiking, right? You've got to have a special thing that bears can't get into because they smell food, they want it.
That's right. And so just sort of going parallel to the bird feeders and jumping into bird baths, no pun intended, for a moment, a couple people wrote in asking about, is it safe to have a bird bath in the winter? Will birds freeze if they see water and bathe in it? And do you guys have any advice for people wondering about bird baths in the winter?
I think birds know what they're doing. They're not going to jump into a water and hurt themselves if it's too cold. So it's totally fine to keep water available for birds in winter, and they trust their judgment about whether or not they want to jump into it.
Yeah, and if you do want to make it something that's a little bit safer for them, keep the water shallow, maybe add a few rocks in your bird bath to give them a spot to stand on, and heated water baths are also an option to help keep it from freezing over every night.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And at least from my perspective, I have a little tiny creek that runs through my backyard, and I see birds in it in the middle of winter. So just even in nature, I've watched birds jump into water when it seems like it. We wouldn't enjoy it anyway,
right.
But they must know what they need better than we do.
I think the birds do survive the freezing rain that we get in the winter too. So.
Right. They're amazing. They're amazing creatures.
Absolutely.
And then one last challenge. Agent 10 wrote in to Instagram saying that he'd really like to offer feeding points to the variety of birds, but my cat is a big and effective hunter. How can I help birds without leading them directly into the predator's mouth?
Gotta put them inside, right?
Yep, that's the easiest way to keep your cat from hurting the birds is keeping it inside. We do have, I think there's a lot of options to still give them that outdoor time, like a catio, keeping it on a leash, or supervised outdoor time. But
yeah, take your cat for a walk. Yeah. It's really cute.
It's totally cute.
My sister has a cat with a leash, and she says the cat loves it.
Yeah.
They go out on walks and hikes all the time.
It's something fun and different to do with your cat.
Yeah.
And there's really there's not really a great way to, the cat's going to do what a cat has evolved to do. It's not you can't have a conversation with your cat about it.
No.
Just like they attack your feet, they're gonna anything that moves. And is there anything on your web when feeder watchers are joining? Do you ask them about whether or not they have cats, outdoor cats, anything? Is that part of the protocol at all? I just wonder. That's sort of like, yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead.
There's a part of, so that count site description form that we were talking about that helps us know what the habitat's like. We have 3 questions at the bottom that ask, for, what is it, I think more than a half an hour for at least 3 days a week. Is there a dog? Is there a cat? Are there squirrels that come near your feeders? And that helps us kind of know what that wildlife activity is like.
Cool. So you can sort of control for that as well, which is great. So jumping back over to food, since we've gotten through the way to take care of the things you're feeding the birds food in and give them a nice environment, hopefully. Nancy wrote into the website asking, would it be possible to offer lists of common winter birds and their favorite seed for different areas of the country?
Well, Nancy, have we got a tool for you? We have a common feeder birds tool on our website, again, feederwatch.org. And that tool, it's interactive. So when you go into it, you'll see a whole list of birds, and then you can filter by your location, the type of food you're providing, and the type of the type of feeder. Platform is one of them. And then it'll give you this filtered list of birds that will come to a feeder in that situation. You can also click on each bird that's in the list, and you can see all of their preferences listed out right there.
Wow.
So
it's an amazing tool.
Absolutely.
It sounds like a lot of fun, actually. One thing that a couple people wrote in about was safflower seed. So one person, Terry, wrote in to say, I bought this safflower seed cylinder. It's basically untouched. Someone else wrote in, Connor wrote in, I have safflower seeds. The House Finches visit and they just drop them on the ground. Or they drop a lot of them on the ground before they select one. So it's kind of 2 different things going on there. One person saying there just doesn't seem to be anybody eating it. Someone else saying they seem to throw a lot of it on the ground before they select. So is there anything special about safflower that birds do or don't like?
Yeah. So this is just one of those seeds that a lot of folks choose to provide when they're trying to control for house sparrows. So house sparrows don't really like safflower that much, and it's a good thing to provide if you're trying to keep them away from your feeders. But birds like cardinals and grosbeaks, I think there's a bunch of species. Again, you can use that common feeder birds tool, select safflower, and you'll see all the different species that like to eat that.
And
But,
so,
yeah.
sort of thinking about all the different kinds of seeds and things there, Joe wrote into the website saying we have wrens, cardinals, titmice, etc. How much do they value a varied offering of seeds? Does each species really prefer a limited type of seed, even if they eat it day after day? And so, you have your tool right now that'll tell you how to attract, but is there anything that you guys have, or which seeds seem to line up with which species, right? That's what your tool kind of can help people do, but is there anything out there that that's known about whether a diversity of items at a feeding station appeals to birds more or less? Any individual species?
I don't know of particular species that like having a diversity, but I do know that if you provide a diversity of seeds, you can get a greater diversity of birds. So the oily seeds like sunflower and thistle really attract a lot of finches and nuthatches and woodpeckers and things like that. But then little millets and corn, that will attract more jays and doves and sparrows. So if you offer a diversity, you'll get a greater diversity.
That's a really great point. And lots of times there's mixes that have all those things in them, right?
Yeah.
So one size fits all kind of thing.
And there are some seeds that are more energy rich than others. So like Emma was saying, those oily seeds like sunflowers and thistle, suet is a great option, peanuts, there's some really energy rich foods that you'll want to make sure whatever mix you have at least a little bit of those in there. So those birds can get the most energy out of the foods they're eating.
Yeah, those are really popular seeds.
Right.
And Denise wrote into the website asking about a particular mixed seed that is mixed seed bag, a bag of mixed seeds, that says that it's fortified with vitamins and minerals. And her question was, do birds need extra vitamins and minerals from their bird seeds? Is there a chance this might harm them? Is there any...
I don't really know if the fortification of seeds is helpful. A lot of birds don't even eat the entire seed. They take the hull out. So a fortified seed that's just on the coating wouldn't even reach a lot of birds.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It depends on what the particular brand is and what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
It's also wonder who certifies that kind of stuff. That's my thought always. Like who's the regulatory agency like really looking at bird seed and making sure there's 4 ounces of iron or whatever.
And again, the birds have a lot of different food sources. So your feeder is only one of those sources, and they're gonna be able to be getting all the nutrients they need from their environment as well. So.
Yeah.
So jumping off bird seed, Vicky wrote into our website asking, is feeding bread to birds unhealthy? Any thoughts on bread or maybe other people food?
Yeah, again, I think this is related back to that, you want to be providing the birds something as close to what they'd be finding in nature as possible. It depends on the bread brand probably and what it's actually made of. If it's super specially processed and has a lot of sugars in it, it might not be as nutritionally valuable to the birds as those seeds and the grains are.
That's great. That's great to know, because you see people with bread. Certainly see a lot of birds in the city eating bread on the ground.
That's true.
So a much broader question came in through our website. Is there anything that has shown that bird feeding contributes to the health or survival of bird species out there? Is there anything that that's been learned through all this bird feeding? Is there some really positive effect for any species?
Yeah, I think that some of the work that has looked at changes in survival in relation to feeders shows that in these times of real cold snaps, super cold times, that's when we can actually see that bird feeders assist the survival of some species.
Okay.
It's been shown in chickadees and I think Carolina wrens. And on the west coast we see in Anna's hummingbirds that they are able to stay longer and further north in winter at sites with bird feeders. So in some cases the feeders that people are putting out are probably helping individuals survive in colder places than they used to.
That's great. That's really good to know. And along with that, it sounds like the other big sort of last category, we've got about 10 minutes left in our hour, and you guys have been really generous with both the time and the answers. It's been really fun listening to you all. And for everybody who's just tuning in, we're sitting with Emma Greig and Holly Faulkner from Project FeederWatch here at the lab. Our last big category of questions from the public has to do with attracting or deterring birds or sometimes furry creatures. And one that I've heard bandied about quite a bit has to do with hot pepper. And Penelope wrote into the website, does hot pepper really deter squirrels? Any information from your experience, your citizen scientist, or the literature about red hot peppers?
Squirrels are wily, and they can find their way around just about anything. I think it all depends on the squirrels that you have at your feeders. Some of them can get used to the seed. Sometimes it will deter them, but you have to think about the effects on the birds as well. And we don't have any research showing that it's good or bad for the birds, but generally in the absence of research like that, we tend to, recommend to stay away from that kind of thing. But we have a lot of other options options you can take to help deter squirrels at your feeders as well that are a little bit safer for the birds.
We've had a very active squirrel on our FeederWatch cam this year because of some vegetation and the placement of the new cam. So it's been, we're currently in the opening stages of a long, drawn-out winter conversation with the squirrel, I think, on camera. But thanks for our viewers for enjoying the squirrel for what it is. It's another piece of the wild sapsucker woods. And they can put away a whole lot of food very fast. They're really amazing animals, too.
That's true.
There's nothing bad about them eating from the same feeder as your birds, but if you do want to deter them, we understand, they eat a lot of food.
Yeah.
We do have some options on our website.
Speaking of other things that people don't always think highly of coming to their feeders, both Janine and Katie wrote in asking about house sparrows. They're taking over my feeder. The red-bellied woodpecker is the only bird that doesn't tolerate these greedy rascals. Is there a way to lure them away, or what should I do about it? Also, is there a way to deter them without deterring other species? And Katie wrote in both for house sparrows and starlings. So do you have any tips for aspiring feeder owners that don't aspire to have some species of birds like house sparrows and starlings?
Yeah, a lot of people don't like having those two species at their feeders. And house sparrows don't like this strange thing called a halo baffle that folks figured out a while ago. How does the halo baffle work? I kind of forget.
Basically a covering that goes over your feeder, and then there's strings or wires that hang down with washers at the end, and something about that prevents them from wanting to go between those wires.
Oh, interesting.
So it works in a lot of cases. Some people find that over time, or in certain regions, there might be too many house sparrows and they end up getting over it. So there are some other options. Safflower seed is a really good choice. Like I said earlier, house sparrows don't like that as much. And starlings, there's actually, so they can't grip and hang upside down. So if you provide something like suet, we describe this more on our website, but basically if you have one of those suet feeders where you can only access it from the bottom, that's a really good thing to help prevent starlings from getting at it.
And they do seem to like suet a lot, starlings.
Yeah.
Their bills seem well made for excavating your suet from your feeders. Yeah, and it's interesting that they don't like. So would people be able to find a description of that halo? What'd you call it? Halo
baffle.
Baffle
Yep.
on your website?
That's correct.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. The other, I thought there was one more deterring. I guess no. The rest are all about attracting. So, what would you say to somebody that like Nelson who wants to just attract cardinals? How do I attract cardinals? Any helpful hints for a cardinal wanter?
Well, cardinals really like safflower seed. So get that safflower cone from the other person and put it out, and maybe they can get some cardinals in their backyard. Sunflower seeds are another good thing for cardinals, and they kind of like eating on, they like a lot of space. They don't want to have to hang on some little tube feeder. So a platform feeder or one of those hopper feeders, those are kind of nice for cardinals.
Yep. And again, that stuff you can find on that Common Feeder Birds tool. You can click right on the cardinal. You can see all the different foods a cardinal will eat and the types of feeders that, the feeder types that it'll be attracted to.
And you can keep cardinals around if you have shrubby areas around your yard, because they love nesting in dense shrubbery. So keep a messy yard, and that'll keep cardinals around all year.
It seems like it'd be something everybody could get behind, just not cleaning up your yard.
Yeah, absolutely.
One less thing to do.
It's really good for birds.
Add brush piles near your feeders, that kind of thing, give them a little bit of refuge so they're not flying all the way across your yard to get to the feeders. They've got a little refuge area halfway in between.
And maybe don't rake up your leaves, because little towhees and juncos want to move under leaves and get the bugs underneath.
Yeah, like there's where you can find some bugs sometimes in the middle of winter too.
Absolutely.
That's right.
So speaking of landscaping or other habitat plants and kinds of things, Casey wrote into the website asking which fruit and berry trees or bushes might best attract cedar waxwings and other fruit-eating birds. Do you guys have suggestions on your website for fruit-eating birds?
We don't have specific species, but generally if it's a native berry-producing plant that's found in your area, you've probably got a pretty good chance of attracting the cedar waxwings to it. I think I've heard mulberry and crab apples and
mulberry.
Some of those native plants should be something that it'll be a good place to start for sure.
Great. Yeah, I love actually watching. As much as I love the birds coming to my feeders, I love actually watching them having to deal with the plants, and hanging on the plants and sort of dripping off the edges and watching it tilt all the way down to the ground sometimes as they try and get the little seed at the very end. I'm always very entertained by that. Two different people wrote in, Elvira and Vicky, wrote in asking about balconies and what they can do to get birds coming to their balconies. Sometimes they in one case talking about there being plenty of birds around, but how can they get them to come over to their balcony? And is there anything you might suggest to someone that probably has a relatively small space like a balcony, and what might be a good way to attract birds there?
Well, they might try a little window feeder, something that sticks onto the window and is clear, and so then it doesn't take up much space, but they can get birds to come real close, potentially. And offering really delicious seeds like sunflower or suet, things that'll really bring those birds in because they just can't resist such a high calorie meal.
Right.
Yeah, and keeping in mind too that it can sometimes take several weeks for a bird to find a new feeder. So if you're not having luck after 2 or 3 weeks with your feeder up, hang in there. It might take a while, but they will eventually find it.
And is there so you talked about how you can feed birds year round. Is there anything about should you be feeding them something different in the winter than in other seasons, or is there any advice or knowledge about that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think suet is a nice winter, cold, northern latitude, cold weather food. It's when it's cold that they can really benefit from that. And also suet can get kind of melty and gross in hot weather, so it's not that great of a hot weather food anyway. So that's kind of a seasonal food item.
Yeah, as well as nectar, sugar water, and fruits. That's a little bit easier to provide in the springtime and the summer. When you're getting the orioles and the hummingbirds coming back from migration.
Oh man, it seems like it's so far away right now.
Right?
We just saw some Baltimore Orioles down on our Panama feeder cam just in the last week, and it's just kind of wish I was down there with them right now. So we just have a few minutes left, and I had one more question for you that's sort of I thought it was a fun one to end on, and then if you guys wanted to finish up by saying anything else about FeederWatch, we'd love to listen. But Joanne wrote into Facebook, and I don't know, I like this idea. We have been feeding the birds here at our house and participating in FeederWatch for 16 years.
Wow.
Are the birds we're feeding today all offspring or family to the birds we started with? And have they grown dependent to being fed? So is there anything you guys know about, the birds that come to your feeders? These people have been feeding birds for years and years and years. Anything we can say about the identity of those birds or their dependence on food, right? Because we all want birds to do great whether we are here or not, right? So is there anything that we know about that?
Well, it's really hard to know what the family lineages of birds without banding them and actually tracking their families. And so the answer to that question is not only extremely tough to get at, but it also is going to differ depending on the species. Some species have a lot of movement from their natal areas, and some species, like those fairy wrens that I studied, you'd see the same bird for 7, 8, 9 years in the same bushes. But that's not always the case with these migratory birds or all of our North American species.
And relating to the way they nest as well. Purple martins, if they're coming back to the same colony every year, they're probably more likely to be related than, bluebirds or tree swallows that need, a couple hundred feet between their nesting areas, their territory. So
I feel like that was the Nest Watch hat
the Nest
going
Watch.
on there.
Yeah.
Well, and do birds seem to grow dependent to being fed?
There's not a lot of evidence that that individuals actually become dependent on feeders. And you can think about how it would not be very adaptive for a northern latitude bird, or really any bird for that matter, to become really honed in on one particular food source.
Right.
Because that means that food source has to be super reliable. So part of what has allowed these species to persist for many, many, many years, millions of years, is that they capitalize on a wide variety of food sources so that they don't have to count on just one. And so that continues in the birds that we have today, and I think prevents them from becoming really dependent on the feeders that we have.
Yeah, and related to that, I get a lot of questions, if I keep feeding birds, when should I take my feeders in? I don't want to prevent them from migrating. Well, migration depends more on the length of day than it does on the availability of food. So keep feeding those birds during migration. They probably actually need it more during that time because they're gearing up, they're getting ready for those long flights.
Those are all really great tips, and it's a really fun way to think about birds, both that they can do just fine without us, but feeding them helps us, learn a little bit more about them. So maybe one last time, what's the best way for people to, if they're interested in learning more about FeederWatch or joining, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Yeah, they can go to feederwatch.org. You can go up in the top right corner. There's a red button that says Join or Renew. Click on that and you can get right into signing up for the project. Or if you go on our About tab, you'll see Project Overview, and you can read a quick overview of what the project is all about if you missed our earlier explanation.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for spending time with us today. I think we all learned a lot, and hopefully our audience enjoyed it. I'm sure we always get a lot of feedback after doing one of these, and it's great, I think, for people to meet the people behind the projects they know so much about, because you guys know more about what's going on with these birds than probably anybody here. So it's great to be able to sit and listen for a while. So thank you.
You're welcome. It was really fun. And I say thank you to all the feeder watchers who have been supporting the program for so long. I just think it is such an amazing contribution to science, to FeederWatch.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I'll have to make sure I get my FeederWatch count done this weekend.
Yeah, you better.
All right. Take care. Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks everybody for listening in, and we'll take you back over to the cam now without our heads sticking in there any longer. And we look forward to hopefully doing more of these in the future. Please go ahead and write us an email or give us feedback on social media. We'd love to hear about it, hear what you'd like to learn more about. And again, thanks, and we'll see you soon.